I'm just going to roll into our first speaker, who is a landscape architect who operates at the scale of both territory and city. His work and research explores and speculates the way in which cities and their environments interact and the social, economic and environmental demands of urbanisation and intensification. He is the author of Made in Australia, The Future of Australian Cities, and he was awarded the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects Gold Medal in 2014. So please welcome to the stage Dr. Julian Bolleter, Assistant Professor, Australian Urban Design Research Centre, University of Western Australia.
Okay, thanks for having me, particularly a foreigner presenting as the keynote for your national conference. So I appreciate the invitation and I'm flattered by it. Thanks to Jan and to Henry. What I'm going to present today is a presentation, The Future of Australasian Cities. This presentation emerges from a book which I wrote co-authored with Richard Weller, who some of you will know, back in 2013. I've tried to kind of spin the content so it has some real meaning, I suppose, for a New Zealand crowd. However, I've also tried to walk a line where I don't start lecturing to you on what are the key issues in New Zealand. So hopefully we'll see how I go with walking that line anyway over the next 40 minutes or so. But I think from talking to the taxi driver on the way to the hotel yesterday that I've got a pretty good sense of what's going on here. And a lot of the dynamics seem to be the same, particularly as it relates to population growth. In Australia at the moment, there is a big kind of mood swing against immigration, against population growth. We've struggled to keep pace with population growth in terms of infrastructure investments, and our cities are starting to really bear the brunt of this, particularly the big ones. I sense the same thing is happening here. What this presentation really, if you take nothing else away from it, is trying to do is actually talk about how we can creatively plan for population growth and really see it as an opportunity rather than a problem which at best needs solving. So we're trying to engage with it creatively. I think landscape architects are well positioned to do this, and so I think it's right. So the structure today of the presentation will be as follows. Firstly, we'll just look at the global context within which Australasia's population growth is occurring to get a bit of perspective on things, which is sometimes lacking. We'll look at the issues that our cities are going to experience as they grow to a doubling of Australia's population by mid-century and a sort of about a 150% increase of New Zealand's population by mid-century or just after 2061. So we'll look how the existing cities are going to bear the brunt of that growth and what some strategies might be for dealing with it and what are the issues which are being compounded in those cities. Both in terms of sprawl, which is greenfield development on the fringe, and infill, which is urban consolidation. By that point, we will argue notionally that Australasian cities are full, and that in the second half of the century, as our population continues to grow, at some point in that second half of the century, we're going to need to look at new cities and decentralisation away from the capitals. Okay, so to the global scene. This is Danica May. She was born in 2011, and she was the world's 7 billionth human being. By the time she celebrates her 40th birthday in 2050, the world's population will have reached about 9 billion, according to the UN. And by the time of her 80th birthday, should she reach it in 2090, the world population will be around 10 billion people and then stabilising for the first time in history. And why? Partly it's because of cities. The population globally is becoming increasingly urbanised. In 2015, we had over 50% of all people living in cities. And so while cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's surface, they're home to nearly 4 billion people. So population is becoming increasingly concentrated in cities and will continue to do so. By mid-century, we'll have about 66% of people living in cities. So there's a giant move, I think as we're all aware, occurring around the world of people moving from rural to urban locations. In terms of the design professions, some of the key issues that we're going to be experiencing globally is how we do that in a way which is humane and which is livable. Currently, about 30% of all urban dwellers around the world are living in slums. Now, like Kevin MacLeod or Prince Charles, we can visit slums and appreciate some of the benefits that they do offer, community and It is very difficult to be lonely when you're living in a room of 5 people, but I think there's real questions here about how we urbanise this huge population in a way which is humane. It's also about ecological footprint. As people move from rural environments into urban environments, the ecological footprint tends to go up. That is all the land that you require to deliver you the food and the services you need to survive, as well as deal with your waste products. And we have obviously very bloated ecological footprints here in Australasia. So I think these are challenges which urban design, or all people in urban design related disciplines will experience. There's one, however, which I consider to be particularly pertinent to landscape architects, is the issue of how we reconcile increasing urbanisation with biodiversity hotspots. This map here shows biodiversity hotspots around the world. There's 35 of them. They're regarded as being the life support systems of the planet. Essentially, biodiversity is not sort of distributed evenly across the globe. It's particularly concentrated within these biodiversity hotspots. We're in one right now, as is my hometown of Perth. It's projected by about 2030, or just 2030, which is no longer that far away, that will urbanise about an additional 1.2 million square metres of land, which is equivalent to an area about the size of South Africa within the biodiversity hotspots. And we yet don't have the models for how we go about engaging with that formidable challenge. And the issue with the biodiversity hotspot is conservation is not optional of them. They guarantee not only the livability of our cities, but also the viability of them. Researchers from Oxford University concluded conservation of the hotspots is not optional. If we fail there, we will lose nearly half of all terrestrial species, regardless of how successful we are everywhere else. Not to mention an almost unthinkably large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and extensive human suffering resulting from the loss of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, for those who don't know, are all the benefits that nature provides us, which is clean air, clean water, sequestering carbon, and providing biodiversity, mental health benefits, physical health benefits, and the like. The big question, I think, for us, and also the other design professions, is how we reconcile the growth of these pimples, these pink dots, with the green of the biodiversity hotspots. The pimples don't show the city size necessarily, but they show its percentage growth to mid-century, so we can see that there's a real issue there of how we integrate those two systems. So that's the global context. Now zooming into the Australasian context. By mid-century, it is projected by the Australian Bureau of Statistics that Australia's population will have just about doubled to 48 million. They're currently at about 25 million. The cities of Sydney and Melbourne, which are currently around 5 million, will have almost doubled in size. Sydney to about 9 million and Melbourne to be about 10 million. So they're almost mega cities. A mega city is 10 million people or more. In Auckland, according to Stats New Zealand, and the Auckland plan, Auckland will go from about 1.5 million and doubling to about 3 million. And Wellington similarly will double. Now, we don't have a crystal ball and anything can happen. Also, all of these organisations have different grades of projections. These typically are the highest ones, but we felt it's prudent to work to the highest projections and you can work back from that point. So typically how we've housed these kind of population growths to date has been in the suburbs. It's been about what I'll call, to try and be inclusive, the Australasian dream. And it's really been the suburbia has been the dominant lifestyle choice for Australasians for at least all of the 20th century. It offers us many benefits, and we can sometimes overlook this. There's great physical and mental health benefits which come with living within nature, within your own private open space. There's the ability to grow food and to kind of get rid of waste products. So our suburbs do offer prized livability, such as the Australian dream would attest. As Frederick Howe said, who's an American planning proponent, he wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, the great cities of Australia are spread out in the suburbs in a splendid way, for miles about are broad roads with small houses, gardens, and an opportunity for touch with a freer, sweeter life which the country offers. So while our suburbs have delivered really quite wonderful livability over the 20th century, the Australian dream is starting to run out of steam. I'd like to explore some of these issues in relation to Perth, but I think we'll find that the issues are quite generic in nature. One is about biodiversity loss. Globally, we're living through what is popularly known as the sixth great extinction. A third of all amphibian species are at risk of extinction. A fifth of the globe's mammals are classified as endangered, threatened or vulnerable. The current extinction rate for birds is faster than any across the 150 million years of bird evolution history. When we zoom into Perth, we can see what's going on. These maps here show as black dots all the development which has happened since we got our first big plan for urban consolidation in Perth. This is when we were meant to really stop doing sprawl. But this has all happened since that plan was issued in the 90s. And much of the development which is occurring is sporadic and is occurring within areas which either once had remnant vegetation or indeed are in areas which have been designated environmentally sensitive. There are species there which exist nowhere else in the world and cannot be offset. Between 2001 and 2010, we were destroying 841 hectares a year of that stuff for suburban development, which reflected the fact that Perth was never an agricultural city. So it was never cleared for agriculture, but it's been cleared for suburbs. As a result of this, the South West Australia Biodiversity Hotspot, within which Perth sits, has more species of threatened plants than most Australian states or indeed countries around the world. Our development patterns on the fringe look something like this. They completely annihilate natural systems. It's also about climate change. As Brendan Gleeson explains, the wonderful climate, the envy of the world, Australia's climate, seems to be turning on us. Terra Australis is becoming Terror Australis, a blast furnace of drought, heat and capricious tempests. So what we're finding is the whole cycles of how plants are fertilised, is being messed up like a badly run public transport system with climate change. Seasonal insects are arriving earlier and later, flowers have reset their clocks and are blooming at unpredictable times. For creatures which are all dependent on this kind of messing up of the timetable to fertilise each other can spell disaster. Climate change is starting to really have an effect in Perth in terms of water shortages. These are new suburban areas north of Perth which have over-exceeded their groundwater allowance. So we've run out of the water to irrigate public open space, and we do not have the models for how we should do this. On the basis of that, Tim Flannery warned that Australia could be the 21st century first ghost metropolis. It's probably alarmist commentary, but there is an issue here. At the same time as the climate is drying, our bushfires are getting more and more extreme. And we've seen this around Australia, the disastrous 2003 Canberra fires, the 2009 Black Saturday fires in Melbourne and the Port Hills fire in New Zealand last year. And we can see this is mapping from the fire emergency services in Perth, showing bushfire vulnerable areas. And we can see all on the edges of the city how vulnerable all that recent suburban development is. At the same time as we're vulnerable to bushfires, we're starting to get a new urban divide occurring within Australasian cities, and I think this particularly applies to Auckland. As Jane Frances Kelly explains from the Grattan Institute, a new urban divide, one that is changing Australia and challenging long-held ideals of fairness, is the growing gap between people who live near the centre of our cities and those who live near the outer fringes. Essentially, as we move to a knowledge economy, all our jobs, all the high-paying skilled jobs tend to be in the city centres. So people living on the fringes are not only denied often the cultural amenity of the city centre, but also the economic opportunities. So we can see here in this map the kind of deprivation index, which is really concentrating deprivation on the fringes of our cities, and with some exceptions in Greyfield middle ring suburbs. So our cities are starting to fracture along socio-economic lines. This is compounded by unaffordable transport. Now, we may all be zipping around in eco-modernised fleets of electric cars in a few years, but particularly for the people living on the fringe who might need 2 or 3 cars, the cost of eco-modernising that whole fleet is going to be really expensive. So we have an issue there of how we service these outer fringe areas with transport. And there's been mapping which has been done to kind of indicate the effect of that on various Australian cities. And part of it reflects the fact that we have infrastructure deficits in all Australasian cities, I would argue, where basically infrastructure has not been able to keep pace with population growth. This map here shows the heavy rail lines in Perth. At least we have some. I believe you guys are missing them on various fronts, development fronts. But because we have a radial system, much of the development which is occurring is between the increasingly wide arms of the public transport heavy rail system. So this means these people are faced with a punishing commute. And it just gets worse, I'm afraid. I'm pretty bleak today, aren't I? But what we're finding is the cumulative effect of punishing commutes, a lack of jobs, of worrying things like bushfires, a lack of private open space in the fringe, a lack of jobs. All of these things are starting to register themselves in terms of mapping around psychological distress, which shows a concentration of that on the fringe. And we can see this on this map here, which is showing, this is mapping from Torrens University, which is showing the level of distress for people out of 100. And we're finding in some of the outer suburbs, people who are considered to be in a state of distress is over 10 out of 100 people. Now, the exact nature of that distress and what's triggering it is not exactly clear in this research, but I would argue that some of it relates to the kind of urban conditions of the fringe. The World Health Organization has predicted that depression will be the second most devastating disease in the world by 2020, and we can certainly see this situation as a harbinger of that emerging issue. So I would argue that given all of these factors which are constraining greenfield development, and which are really saying it's not the opportune urban form for the 21st century, that the Australasian dream is now running out of steam. So how are we responding to this? One way we are responding is trying to do better suburban development, which is not easy. This is a scheme for a new suburb on the edge of Perth called Wollongong. In Perth, we're sprawling into geomorphic wetlands, which means soggy farmland, basically. And this scheme was all about, it was a provocation by the client to say, design a suburb as if landscape mattered. What a great client. Pity the developers didn't share those sort of sentiments. But it was all about living streams, and it had a landscape urbanist philosophy, which was the idea that these living streams, which are the green network, clean stormwater, funnels biodiversity, can act as a kind of structuring device for urbanism. It got Perthed, however. That was what it looked like before being Perthed and then after. So the developers and the kind of branding agents that work with the developers felt it necessary to kind of reform it. Rather than being sensitive to a geomorphic wetland, we had to put 4 metres of sand fill over the top of the wetland so that we could build houses on concrete slabs, which is what we like to do. So I guess what I'm saying is the margins which operate on the fringe and the kind of development models make that very difficult to engage with in the Australian context. So most of the attention has shifted to infill. There's been a real mantra, I guess, by planners over the last 20 years that sprawl bad, infill good, sprawl bad, infill good. We must do more infill. Across the Australasian region, we're trying to do about 60% infill. You guys have got a reasonably high target here in Auckland, which I believe you're not meeting, and that's hardly unusual. Most Australian cities are not. Perth's got the lowest target of 47% infill, which is urban consolidation development, and we typically do about 30%. The way state governments are typically trying to do density is activity centres, which I believe is a similar policy to what you have here, which is just putting people near public transport. Makes a lot of sense in an oil-constrained future, that people should live near public transport systems. However, and around the nation, we're trying to do about 343 of those. So that really is the dominant model. That's the flagship of infill development approaches around the country. The issue is that it's very hard to corral development around activity centres. Often they're heritage train station precincts. The community really likes it the way it is. There's fragmented land ownership. There's a lot of things there which are working against doing precinct urban densification around public transport. So in Perth, these are similar to the previous maps. All the black dots is all the infill that's happened, and most of it's nowhere near public transport and is not leading to decreased car usage. This is called transport-orientated development. We call it transport-disorientated development. It truly is. It's also not really happening near where regional space is. So what we're doing is we're densifying suburbs without public transport, and we're doing it where there's not access to regional open space, which is where people find the most pure expression of nature in a city. And we know as cities get denser, it's called the compensation hypothesis, that people will seek out nature, they'll seek out green space to try and get some sort of symbolic equilibrium with their urban environment. So these people and these little black dots are nowhere near the regional open space which would provide that connection with nature. And they're certainly not getting it in backyards, because this is what's happening. This is a happy suburb, perhaps like you might find in Auckland somewhere, about R12, before the suburban planners went in there and rezoned it to R25. And then at R25 to R40, which means 25 to 40 dwellings per hectare, basically the houses are being dumped into backyards, and we're losing the mature tree canopy cover. About 60, in Australian cities, about 60% of all tree canopy is actually in private land. So the development of backyards is really destructive in this respect, because an urban forest is not just the nice trimmings to a city. It provides the ecosystem services of sequestering carbon, filtering and cleaning stormwater and filtering it to the aquifer, providing biodiversity, physical and mental health benefits. So to erode the kind of legacy of those urban forests is a really dangerous thing. And quite understandably, in Australia, there's it's what's called a public sullenness around infill. The Grattan Institute estimate that 11% of people support infill in their suburb. I think in Perth it's a bit lower than that. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard, but somehow that word doesn't really, I think, capture the situation at its truest. We preferred the word bananaism, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. I don't think planners should have all the fun with acronyms. So this is a bit of what's being delivered on the ground, and I believe some of these outcomes are similar to what we might find in Auckland. We call this the 50 Shades of Grey. I don't know if do you guys say tight as a fish's ass here? I don't know, maybe you don't. That's my roof. That's not my house, but I'm standing on my roof there. My neighbours don't know that I do this, but they're quite famous. And this is the Ned Kelly. Do you know Ned Kelly? He's got the slot. Anyway. So what we're finding is we're densifying our suburbs. While we're trashing the kind of leafy green livability of the suburbs, we're not yielding the urban kind of outcomes that you would expect from a real city. Like there's not small bars opening up in the corner on this street or cafes. We're not getting much activation occurring. What we're getting is a street littered with cars because no one's using public transport, and we're losing the urban canopy cover, which is so important. So enough relentless negativity. Let's take a quick break to have a drink. So it's easy to kind of slag everything off, particularly as an academic, but we asked ourselves the question is, what could be an Australasian dream for infill for the 21st century? Our idea is that basically that you could take the wonderful amenity we got from private open space, from backyards in the 20th century, and look to provide that in a communal fashion in parks, and that you would densify around it. We've talked about transport-orientated development. I think that's fine, but there's a lot more to life than transport. So we think maybe green-orientated development, God, certainly has a bit of a ring to it. And essentially it is about making public the private amenity which underwrote the livability of the Australian dream in the 21st century. Now, life is not just about parks, even for landscape architects. It is also about public transport. So what we did is to actually take heavy rail stations and establish a cycle shed of about a 5-minute ride or a 15-minute walk, and then picking up major parks within those catchments and looking to densify around those parks, which would then be upgraded to accommodate the kind of density. These parks look typically something like this. They're a legacy of the recreation movement in the mid-20th century, which was the idea that people needed physical recreation to temper their immoral impulses and make them both physically healthy but also morally healthy and good citizens. That typically reflected itself in big ovals. They're kind of turf deserts. They typically actually depress the value of real estate around them, which is hard to believe because the literature always suggests that parks elevate it. In Perth, they depress it because people don't want to live near the lighting and sporting and parking sort of hassles of big ovals. And frankly, the parks are not providing much amenity. You'd be considered kind of quite strange, if not suspicious, if you were to take a book and sit under a tree in one of these parks. So our idea is to actually, as part of green-orientated development, is to densify around the park and then try and provide the wonderful kind of private open space amenity of the 20th century into the park, and to develop synergies between density and green space. This is what we're not finding with transport-orientated development to the same degree. Now, we all know the benefits of green space when you're living in dense urban form. You get physical health benefits. You're physically healthier just by looking at green space. This has been proven in studies which have looked at people recovering from traumatic operations. If you put people in a freeway-facing room and people in a landscape courtyard-facing room, as they recover, the recovery times are markedly different. Being able to look at green space helps you to relax, which helps your body to dedicate the energy it needs to recovery. So there's physical health benefits of living around a park. There's mental health benefits. It's correlated through research that if you have views of green space, you're less likely to have domestic violence in a house. I'm not saying being near a park will solve that issue, but it certainly is part of the equation. It's about biodiversity. Being near a park helps to regulate the climate, which is going to get increasingly important, purifies air and can purify water. So we know all those benefits. We've heard all of that. But densified areas also provide parks benefits. We have potential grey water supplies, which as our climate dries, in Perth in particular, which can irrigate the park. We have increased flows of stormwater, again for irrigation. We get nutrients from communal composting, which can be dedicated to growing plants in the park. We have passive surveillance, capital activation and labour, all which can contribute to the growth of the park. So there's real synergies there, which we can seek to exploit as part of God. And the idea here is in this space that we actually start to divide the park up a little bit like you might find in Europe in terms of the plots, productive plots you can hire or rent, where we actually develop parks as a kind of messy space where people can really be creative and make a mess and have celebrations. It's not just a manicured, elaborate landscape space. Rather, it's a real working and sometimes quite messy space. There's actually a lot more open space and streetscapes, though, than parks. So we started to think, well, how could parks be connected up into a micro network, which might facilitate the movement of electric scooters and bikes and things through the suburbs? Not a big, clumsy 19th century heavy rail network, but a much finer filigree network through the suburbs of upgraded streets, which are densified, which lead to upgraded parks, schools and train stations. It could look something like this. As we move more and more to car share models and fully automated vehicle models, and also smaller garbage trucks, the idea being that we may be able to free up enough road space to really start to treat certain streets where it's appropriate more as linear parks, which allow a degree of vehicle connectivity, that's fine, and some parking, but can also start to contain functions like large swales, community gardens, playgrounds, some bush, plenty of mature trees. So the idea here is that our streets become like linear parks. And it could look something like this. Okay, so by way of conclusion to the first part of the talk, look, I think there are a lot of issues for how we densify our cities. And certainly how they expand. They will continue to spread to mid-century, there's no doubt about it. But we would say, as a really clumsy generalisation, to mid-century, the growth in our capital cities of population might not be a bad thing if it's well handled. Activity centres still make sense, and yes, some people value living near a train, and that's great. We've also got corridor development along the tramways in Melbourne, for instance. That's not a bad thing too for some people, and we would say densification around POS is also going to be important. So our cities could become more urbane, more activated, more vibrant by mid-century. But we would argue by mid-century that they're pretty much full, and you don't want to just keep ramming people into them. So at that point, Sydney is almost a megacity of 10 million, and so is Melbourne. Perth's about 6.6 million. Auckland's up around 3 million. So it's doubled in size. And we would argue that those cities are pretty much full at that point. That means, in Australia, for instance, of the 2100 forecast of 70 million, we're still going to have another 22 million people in the second half of the century, which got to land somewhere. Of the New Zealand 2100 forecast of 9.9 million, there's still, even after Auckland is 3 million, you could still expect to add about 2.5 million people in the second half of the century to the nation. And there's we don't have planning which typically deals with this time span. So it's currently being unplanned for. The elephant in the room is climate change. And I think we're going to find, we're already finding with Tasmania, which is that we're getting migration to Tasmania in Australia for the reasons of the fact that it's fairly well insulated from climate change. But these are not climate change refugees as you might picture them. These are people who are wealthy enough to own, who may live in Sydney but are wealthy enough to open a second property in Hobart. It's also wineries who are moving down to Tasmania for the fact that it's becoming a good wine growing region. But it is projected by about 2050 that we will count about 150 million climate change refugees in the world. Now that comes out of empirical research, but it's a contested figure. A lot of those migrants will just move within countries, like Bangladesh will flood, but not the whole country will flood. So there'll be some opportunity to move within those countries. But there's going to be some, I think, and rightly so, there's going to be an expectation that countries like Australia and New Zealand, which have a bloated carbon footprint per capita, should be taking in climate change refugees. And by the second half of the century, there could be a lot more than 150 million. There's many reasons why a lot of the big Asian cities are in estuaries and are sinking at the same time as the sea level is rising. So there's obvious issues there with sea level rise, but there's some more concerning ones too, such as wet bulb temperature. A wet bulb temperature is where you stick a thermometer and put a wet flannel over the top. It basically measures humidity and heat. When that reaches 35 degrees, even a healthy person sitting under a tree will die in 6 hours because the body can no longer cool itself. And it's projected in an unmitigated climate change situation that by 2070, that these events will be becoming not regular, but will be occurring particularly in Southern Asia, but possibly in Northern Australia and Southeast Asia. So this is a really alarming potential situation. It does rely on climate change being largely unmitigated, but Australia's carbon output is increasing year by year. So that's not an unlikely prospect. The issue with these lethal wet bulb temperature events is that the people who are not inside die. Those people who are inside, if their air conditioning doesn't work, die. So I don't mean to be too alarmist, but this is not research which is coming from some obscure greeny left-wing kind of website. This is peer-reviewed research which is being published, so I think we should take it seriously. So what does it mean for us? I think it means that countries like New Zealand and places like Tasmania are going to be looking increasingly attractive. And we will need an urban system which is resilient enough to be able to absorb large influxes of people quite quickly. It's evident that our capital cities will probably not be capable of this alone. So the question we asked ourselves, well, okay, if our population is going to keep increasing in the second half of the century, are new cities the answer? History would definitely say no. I've just finished a book called The Ghost Cities of Australia, which is looking at failed experiments in new city making in Australia. We've had some classics, so this is a bit of light relief after all the gloom and doom. This is a guy called A. Griffiths from Queensland. Funnily enough, he owned a railway sleeper business. He proposed a 11,000 kilometre railway circumscribing Central Australia, a trunk line out which radiating lines would connect to the coast. The idea was that tens of thousands of guys after the Second World War, when they were demobilised from the army, would come back, and rather than fighting in Asia, they would fight the country. They would get out in the interior and build railway lines, and they would stay and end up living in these cities, tens of thousands of people who would populate the interior. It was a kind of compelling diagram, but completely missed the carrying capacity of the nation and of that landscape. There was a lot of romantic ideas about how you could use pastoralism and mining to really generate the economy for these cities. And the idea being that in the case of an invasion, we could quickly deploy our army to any point along the coast by rail quite quickly. We had other kind of wild ideas also after the Second World War. There was something definitely in the air then, I'm not sure what it was. This is Ian Idris. In his book Onward Australia, he proposed re-engineering the nation's hydrological systems. And he said, Australia's cities of the future will not be found in 5 or 6 spots on our 12,000-mile coastline. They will stretch continuously along the rivers of the inland plains, from Roma to the Murray Mouth and from Hughenden to the Lake Eyre. So his idea was to actually to gouge a kind of canal from Adelaide essentially through to Lake Eyre to flood the central Australia and then to build cities around it. Again, a complete romanticisation of the landscape and what Australia could really sustain. In the 1970s, we had a very progressive federal government led by Gough Whitlam, and they planned a massive campaign of decentralisation and new cities. They believed Australian cities were at crisis point. They were getting increasingly polluted, stratified in socio-economic terms, congested, unfriendly, and basically they were considered to be at a crisis point. And as a way of solution, they proposed decentralisation to the regions, places like Orange, places like Monarto in South Australia, were all new cities which were planned, which are shown on that diagram. One of them, Monarto, was quite interesting. It was going to have 200,000 people by the end of the 21st century. Didn't come to fruition. Typically in Australia, what happens is you have a change of government, and the new government comes in feeling a bit vengeful and takes a knife to any of the big visions that have been proposed. It actually turned into a open range zoo, which was really nice. But that's what it would have looked like if it had been built. Quite progressive planning by Shanklin Cox. So it's evident, anyway, light relief over. It was evident that in the 20th century, new cities were probably not really needed. Canberra was an exception, but that was never going to be repeated, being the nation's capital. So we ask ourselves, will the right time for developing new cities be the mid-century or the 21st century? We would say yes. The reason is current livability rankings. They give us a guide to this. When we look at the 10 most livable cities on the planet, the biggest is Melbourne, which is 4 to 5 million people. So what we can find is there's a correlation between the livability of a city and its size. This is judged by The Economist, who obviously have their biases. But nonetheless, what we find is as you grow cities to above megacity size, 10 million or more, they do start to grind the populations down. They become more congested, less affordable, less egalitarian. And I think anyone who's been to Sydney recently will start to get a premonition of what this might feel like. Sydney's already hit 5 million people, but I would argue that socioeconomically it's sort of splitting along the seams. We have a lot of congestion. We have terrible affordability issues, perhaps as bad as you do in Auckland even. And the city is really not coping well with the influx of population. Sydney is growing very fast, and it's very difficult. It's easy to say that we just need to provide the infrastructure, but it's very difficult to do when state governments have an infrastructure deficit. There's literally not the money there to be providing the kind of infrastructure investments we need. So welcome to mega city Sydney. Imagine what Sydney might be like when you dump another 5 million people into Western Sydney. You'd need to be pretty optimistic to think that's going to lead to a more livable Sydney. And, you know, this is starting to take expression in a kind of xenophobia in Australia against religion. Against immigrants. Always got room for you guys, though, so don't worry. But anyway, we'll be the climate change refugees coming to you more likely. So if we say the existing cities shouldn't become megacities, we don't want a Sydney of 10 million or more, or an Auckland of 3 or 5 million people, then we need to build new cities. We did some mapping, being landscape architects. We got a bit McCarthyan, and we did mapping of all the different factors which could constrain or make opportune urban development of new cities in this century. We looked at water, always important, food. We want to be near good agricultural areas, but we don't want to build on them, which is what we've done in Western Sydney. How the climate's changing, natural amenity, cultural amenity, even the symbolism of where you would locate a city. And we overlaid all the factors which would constrain new city building, and it shows what you'd evident, which is pretty self-evident. We probably don't need a new capital city in Alice Springs or on the Nullarbor Plain between Perth and Adelaide, but we find there's some fertile areas on the east and west coasts. This is also mapping, which I think is one layer that we looked at, which is sustainable carrying capacity. We didn't do this mapping, this guy, Murray Lane, but it's basically showing the maximum number of people that can be supported in perpetuity in an area in relation to food, energy, fibre and environmental protection mechanisms. And what we find is essentially in Australia, many of the areas of Australia, despite it being an enormous continent with a sort of meagre population, a lot of them are above it, the carrying capacity of the landscapes. Particularly Northern Australia has exceeded the carrying capacity of that landscape almost by 500%. So if we are in a situation where we have to lock a nation down and for whatever reason global trade is not functioning as it is, then these areas will struggle to provide the kind of what we need to sustain human life in them. But again, particularly in the southwest and to a degree in the southeast, we're finding that those areas still do have carrying capacity. We need to be careful here because there is a lot of people going around talking about new cities in the north of Australia. This is Benjamin Gusson, which is proposing a Singapore or a Dubai of the north in the Kimberley. I did the images, he's a lawyer, but these are ideas of charter cities which are not, they're governed by their own charter, a bit like Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai are. So the idea there that we could actually deal with immigration and particularly humanitarian immigration in new cities so that the immigrants don't trouble us in the big capitals. But it's a worry because of the kind of carrying capacity issues. This is another one which is a refugee city off Darwin. We would say you really need to be developing where the carrying capacity is highest. We looked at 2 regions which we'll call mega regions, extending between Brisbane and Melbourne on the east coast and Gerald and Busselton on the west coast with Perth in the middle. These areas seem particularly fertile, and you'll notice I'm talking about mega regions here. A mega region was defined by Richard Florida as areas which are continually lit when viewed from an orbiting satellite. They're chains of smaller cities connected by good public and private transport infrastructure. The advantage of a mega region is it means the cities within it can maximise the advantages of being connected into this network without growing into mega cities necessarily themselves. They're very, very powerful and resilient economic structures. But they're also potentially more livable. This is a view from an orbiting satellite of Boswash, which is the mega region connecting Boston to Washington. So it could be a model for, Australia's 21st century development. How do you catalyse a mega region, though? We believe it's probably going to be high-speed rail. And now there's been lots of proposals for high-speed rail in Australia, and I noticed some here too. And people groan when it comes up. It's like, oh, here we go again. But We think the reason it's coming up is probably because it does have validity. However, the time has just not been right. We would say by mid-century, the idea of high-speed rail from Brisbane to Melbourne through Sydney and Canberra on the east coast, and similar on the west coast, with new stops about every 350 k's along it. High-speed rail, you don't want to stop about every hour or so. You could actually build a whole chain of new cities, which could mean that you don't need a Sydney of 10 million. You could actually, by mid-century, start to disperse population along high-speed rail links. Basically, nowhere on that high-speed rail link is more than 2 hours from a capital city. So there is some potential to commute back for work, perhaps not every day of the week, but by other days of the week. Through this kind of structure, you have 25 new cities. If you say there's 20 million people left over in the second half of the century we've got a house, that would mean 25 cities of 800,000 people each. Of course, it won't work out like that, but that gives you some sense of the scale. It's also about the NBN, the National Broadband Network, which we in Perth call the NBWEN, which would mean that you could potentially telecommute other days of the week to work in the capital cities. We have great difficulty decentralising employment. So for people to be able to live in the regions and access digitally or in real terms, the jobs of the city centres is going to be very, very important. But of significance to us, particularly as landscape architects, is biodiversity. We advocate looking at these mega regions as not just an urban and infrastructural kind of network, but also as a network of connectivity of green systems. In this century, with climate change, plants and animals will need to move to survive the changing climate. So the idea we've shown in a very simplistic form here is the revegetation or riparian corridors to create networks of connectivity. And all these cities that we've planned are located in already cleared land. The Convention for Biological Diversity, which we've signed up to, says Australia should reserve 10% of its land mass for biodiversity, and we're currently under that figure. So this would be a way of trying to achieve that by looking at biodiversity, urbanisation, infrastructure as an entwined system at the mega-regional scale. Viewed from an orbiting satellite in 2100, it could look something like this: 17 stops of 800,000 people in the regions, entwined. While you have the light of the mega regions urbanism, you also have the dark matter of the green systems, as well as being entwined with agriculture. This is a city potentially between Sydney and Canberra, which is about only 20 minutes from Sydney, and 25 minutes to Canberra, which could be an Australian Masdar city. As soon as you visualise a city like this, you run the risk of looking pretty stupid, because these visions never come to fruition like this, and planning history is littered with failed visions. But we wanted to excite people with the idea that this doesn't need to just propagate or irrigate more suburbia. It could be sort of urban models like we've never seen in Australia. This is a kind of a lifestyle city, perhaps offering coastal livability between Newcastle and Sydney. Coastal livability, which has long ceased to be an option for average landscape architects in Sydney. And even cities like we've never seen before in Australia, an alpine city between Canberra and Albury-Wodonga, a city of smaller hamlets. So you could sit up there in your mountain home and work on your laptop. So there's different ways of living, and we looked at a similar thing on the west coast. Again, coastal amenity. Kevin Rudd, you might remember, was our Prime Minister, and he actually read our book in his second go at being Prime Minister, and then he got voted out 2 weeks later, which was unfortunate. He said he was very excited about what we'd done. He was less excited about getting voted out. Anyway, by way of conclusion, I think we can take heart from the fact that we, as Australasians, have built 4 out of the world's 10 most livable cities, according to The Economist. So that is the Indigenous people of those lands, and then successive waves of boat people and plain people have gone on to build some really great cities, even though we don't, I think Australasia generally, we don't consider ourselves to be great city builders in the way that the heroes of the past, like the Haussmanns of Paris or Rome, are great cities. We don't consider our cities great cities, but they have delivered us wonderful livability. So I think despite while a lot of the challenges that we confront can cause you to feel a bit despondent, I don't think we should be paralysed by that. I think we should take courage and be creative about how we plan with cities. I guess that is the overarching message I would have to you all, is while there are many things which are worrying and concerning about the situation which is emerging with climate change in particular, we are in a period which offers us unparalleled creative scope. This population growth which occurs this century, it is arguable will not occur again. So we're in the middle of this huge creative opportunity, and sometimes I think we're in the midst of that. We can lose perspective on that. And I think many of these challenges are really about landscape, and I would advocate for a much stronger role for landscape architecture in planning. I think as it applies to the planning of infill, say in Perth, the absence of landscape architectural expertise and knowledge and sensitivity has meant that we've developed infill policies which are catastrophic from a landscape perspective. And I don't think we can afford to give planners that kind of latitude again. I would say the same with outer suburban development. I think these are spaces we need to be heavily engaged with. And over the longer term, not perhaps just yet, I think advocating for decentralisation and mega-regional models will be really important, because a lot of the issues we're facing will not be solved just in the capital cities. As to that very big issue that I posed earlier on about the biodiversity hotspots and city growth, I think there is no one better to deal with that than landscape architects. I think that's the defining challenge of our region and our globe and our profession in this century. And there is no one better to do it. There's always a sense with cities that there's someone out there that understands everything about them, but they don't. Everyone's got a fractional view. But the good thing about landscape architecture as opposed to urban ecologists is we can turn all this through design. So we can understand biodiversity, and then we can actually design with that as a creative force. And I think that's a really powerful thing. So we're uniquely placed to deal with these issues, and I think we shouldn't. Sometimes landscape architects can be a bit passive-aggressive and a little bit quick to pull back. But I think we should be staking our claim on these issues because they really are about landscape. And the issue of the biodiversity hotspots and how we reconcile them with city growth is not just about livability, it's about viability. So there's nothing more important. So hopefully this presentation has been enlightening on that front, and thanks for listening, thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conference.